Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Kathleen Gasparian. I'm an immigration attorney based out of New Orleans, Louisiana. But because immigration is considered federal law, which I will explain in the course of this program, our practice is all over the U.S. We work with students and scholars and universities and people in trouble and all sorts of stuff for a really long time. So I'm excited today that we're talking to all sorts of different people. There's some people at universities who advise students. It looks like there's some faculty, and it looks like there's students and scholars. And so this is great. We're going to have a lot of things to talk about. The point of today is to really talk about what are people's rights in the United States. So we're talking about enforcement and we're talking about rights, right? So the powers and the protections. And every good lawyer is only as good as their warning label. So this is my official warning, which is I'm really trying to give you guys a perspective on the law and how the law is structured. And if you have specific things that have happened to you or you're worried about your specific case, it's really in your interest to not just rely on this presentation, but to make a, consultation with an attorney, spend the time, get good information. And by the way, Google didn't go to law school. So I'm just saying, like, I'd be very careful about relying on the internet for certain types of things. And I will also say, I am one opinion of many, many opinions about the different things happening in the United States right now when it comes to immigration enforcement or when it comes to how law enforcement acts and interacts with the human beings in our country. And there will be, different attorneys are going to give you different specific advice about what to do in an exact situation. And one of the things that's going to be really frustrating about this presentation is there's a lot of questions I don't have absolute answers for. I can tell you some things I think about. I can tell you what I think are good things to do in a situation. But one of the things we are absolutely seeing right now is the administration, right, who dictates what the priorities are for the enforcement priorities of the Department of Homeland Security, has been really very open that they want to try and expand those powers as much as possible. And we have protections, right? We have Congress and we have the courts that put limits on and the Constitution that help put limits on those actions. But the reason that the Supreme Court of the United States is decorated with turtles everywhere is because the pace of justice is slow. And it's gonna take time for our courts and everything else to catch up with some of the things that are happening every day. So what should happen is sometimes very different from what is happening, or what the law says doesn't mean that people don't take actions that violate the law. And we're all going to find out where things are going to fall, right? We're very much in a time of legal upheaval when it comes to enforcement and the rights of law enforcement. And uh, as a lawyer, it's fascinating. As a human being, it is scary. So just keep that in mind. So, real basics, okay? Because I think when we're talking about a lot of the different issues and questions that everybody sent in, we have to start with how does the law divide people up, okay? And so we have immigration law, which is a piece of all of the laws that govern the United States or govern things that happen inside the United States. And so immigration law makes a distinction, and this is a very simple version of it. I always say there's five kinds of people in the United States under immigration law, right? US citizens, so those are the ones who are considered fully admitted into the political economic community. have the most rights, have like the best backstage pass, right? Like you can go all sorts of places and do all sorts of things. Then you have permanent residents. And those are people who, right, green card holders, right? I have permission to live and work in the United States. We call it permanent, but that is not true. It can be lost. It can be lost in lots of different ways, including criminal convictions and spending too much time out of the US. Then we have non-immigrants. These are going to be F's and J's, right? People who have come for a specific thing for a limited period of time. And then we have people who are here in some kind of, they have something paperwork, but it's not quite non-immigrant status. That's like TPS or DACA or an asylum application. And then we have what DHS calls illegal or undocumented, which is in their definition, people who either came in without authorization or came in by fraud or have overstayed their time, right? So all of that is in one category as well. So immigration law makes those distinctions, right? So what can all of those different, those five categories do in the United States? Really kind of depends. We talk about that is our rights, right? What are the things we have the right to do, or what can we do here in the US as we go about our daily life? And so when we talk about constitutional rights or civil liberties, that's what we mean, right? Can I, you know, can I prevent the military from taking over my land? Can I go to work? Can I stand on my rooftop and recite, the Iliad? Like, what can I do without getting in trouble, basically? And so the Constitution sets forth, right, how the U.S. is supposed to operate, and it also sets out, right, what are the protections that people inside the United States have. And we also have our Bill of Rights, which is part of that. And so in those documents and in the other parts of the law that are not immigration law that help delineate where, the extent of those rights, we have different words that get used. Sometimes it says citizen, sometimes it says person, sometimes it says people, and sometimes the law talks about aliens. And in law, those words all mean really big, different things. And you're like, but wait, they're the same words. And it's like, no, they're really big, different words when we talk about legal analysis. So if you are not a US citizen, right, you may not be able to express your civil rights in the same ways that US citizens can. If you, and it will depend on the context of it. If you are considered undocumented, if you have no status, if you entered without authorization, you may not get some of the protections of the Constitution, or they may not necessarily all apply in immigration proceedings, because immigration is a civil, quasi-civil proceeding. It's not a criminal proceeding where we have the biggest protections. Also, our Constitution only applies on soil, right? In the US. So if you're not in the US, if you're at an embassy or you're trying to enter the US, the amount of expression you get of your rights is probably very, very, very small to non-existent, right? And this is something that lawyers argue about all the time, but it's something to be thinking of. So what are some things that are really easy? Okay. So basically, in general, in the US, everybody who's here, regardless of immigration status, can rent or own property. There's some changes happening to that, and some states that are trying to say if you're not a US citizen, there's certain property you can't own. But on the whole, you can rent or own property, enter into contracts, which means get married, right? Marriage is a contract. Get sued because you got in a car accident, right? If you are not a citizen, so anybody who's not a US citizen from a permanent resident down is supposed to be reporting their address changes to Department of Homeland Security. And for many, many years, there wasn't a formal mechanism for that. Recently, and I say recently, like a year ago, they started setting that up so that ideally people are very easily notifying, even if you are undocumented, they want you to be putting in your address. Whether or not you should is a discussion you should have with a lawyer because there's pros and cons to it for sure. Work is not a right. Work authorization is a privilege. If you're a US citizen, right, it is considered a right, but there's a lot of argument about whether or not for anybody else, it's really considered a privilege under immigration law. So far, travel inside the US, with some exception along the southern border, we don't have interior checkpoints, right? That's one of the big things about our Constitution is we're supposed to have free interstate commerce. Down at the southern border, that's an exception, but on the whole, we haven't gotten to something that changes that yet. Now, travel in the US, meaning, and whether that's I want to walk from my house to the grocery store, or I want to get on a plane and fly to, Daytona for spring break, means you are always supposed, if you are not a citizen, you are always supposed to have documents on you that demonstrate your status. So if you are a permanent resident, you always carry your green card. If you are an F1 or a J1, you should always have your DS 2019 or your I-20 with you. And you're going to go, but wait, I don't want to carry my original documents around. They're like, I'll lose them. So this is what I always say, which is if you are within like 20 minutes of your house and you can get home and get your documents, it's okay to just have a copy. But if you're going to be leaving your town, like especially if you're going to go on vacation to Spring Break, Florida, make sure you have your originals with you. Make sure you have hard copies somewhere. Make sure a friend of yours has a really good copy of them. And so that you can always access your documents. What else is on my, and everybody, regardless of their status, from US citizen all the way down to the very, very bottom, always has protections in the criminal context. That's where our Constitution says it is the most important protections for the people. Okay. And so what else, right? If you are working, and usually whether or not you have work authorization, you have a right to be treated fairly by your employers. If they don't pay you, you can sue them, right? Like that's how it should be. You should be treated the same as US workers, right? This is a lot of what's in our protections in our visa programs, like the H-1B and permanent residence. There's a balance between protecting the US worker, but also protecting the foreign national worker. Sometimes there are some jobs that you have to be a citizen to have, like, working for the government in certain agencies. But on the whole, there shouldn't be, there's not necessarily limits. But an employer is not required to choose to sponsor foreign nationals for visas, right? That's an option by the employer. There's no requirement that an employer who started you off on OPT has to sponsor you for H-1B. It doesn't work like that. Now, you might be able to get credit cards, loans, all sorts of different things. Some of it's going to vary state to state. Some of it will depend on your status. Some things you can do if your status is work authorized. Sometimes you can't. And also banks have different rules, right? So banks have their own sets of rules that are sometimes not really tied to immigration law, right? Or they'll say, we want you to have a social security number because it's so much easier for them. So one of the things that's definitely been going on in this world, our world of international students and scholars, over the last year or two has been a question about how much can international students and scholars or foreign nationals in the US express their political opinion. And this is shifting wildly, right? There is a court in the Northeast, and now I don't remember which court, who has really gone after the Department of Homeland Security about how this type of monitoring of political activity or speaking out, going after foreign nationals who have expressed a political opinion is wrong. But the truth is, like, Department of Homeland Security will say they can do it, right? They can do whatever they want. And the administration has put out orders, and so an executive order is when the president says, this is how I want the agency to enforce the law. This is how we are going to be playing ball. These are the rules for our game. We know this administration has said we are going to go after anything we think is certain types of bad speech, right? Anything they think is anti-Semitic, anything they think is about overthrowing the United States. And they've even said, like, we're going to ask universities to engage in monitoring the speech of foreign nationals. How they get backed up or where those lines get drawn are key as what we're figuring out in the courts right now. So part of it's going to depend on where you are and what your college wants to do about it. So, can you have a political opinion? Absolutely. You can have any opinion you want inside your head, right? The question is, can you say your opinion out loud? Well, and I think the answer is yes. And it all will depend on the exact facts as to what is going to be okay and not okay. So, my example is if I invite you over to my house and we sit down and have a dinner, I'd love to hear your political opinion, especially if you can be polite and you're well reasoned and we're having a very civil conversation, right? But the second you stand up on my table and start yelling, we're going to have a problem, right? And so what is the problem? Is it that you are recruiting people to an idea? Is it that the action itself might be construed as violent? These are, there's a lot of soft and hard lines in this. So there's different things we're talking about, right? Can you stand on a street corner and yell what you think? Absolutely. Will that get you arrested by the police? Probably not, right? Maybe your neighbors call and say, hey, there's a guy being loud, and the cop comes by and, moves you along. If you're doing something that's clearly authorized under law, like that, like you attend a protest, is that a problem for law enforcement, the police who are enforcing criminal codes? No. Is it going to be a problem for an ICE officer or an officer at an embassy who is deciding questions that are squishy, right? Who's deciding questions like, do I think this person is going to comply with the laws in the United States? Do I think this person deserves to be in the US, right? It's a discretion question. Or do I think this person's primary purpose is to come to study, like what is required for an F1? And so there can be lots of other things that happen in a immigration officer's mind that are not about is it legal or not, but the question is, does it create a ground for them to refuse your entry? We also have to be really, really careful about anything that's going to look like related to violence or instigating violence. And that can be, sometimes you have to be really thoughtful about like where you're making your donations and things like that. I think there's lots of different ways to be political and have a political opinion and expression that are not going to impact your immigration process. So I would say be very thoughtful and careful about it. And yes, we have had, a few years ago, actually more than a few years ago, I had a person who was very active in union organizing in their home country. They were very active on social media about it. And is that overthrowing the government? No. Did it cause delays at the embassy? Absolutely. Because there was so much expression on social media, the embassy really had to go through and vet it and look at it. So know that like these all have impacts. So that is an example of you have your right or your interest in speaking your mind, and the government has a right or an interest in keeping public safety, in all sorts of different government issues, right? And so those things balance out. When we are talking about what powers do the police have or what powers does the government have, it depends on the circumstance as to what they can do, right? Like, so what's more important, the person's civil liberties or the government's right to govern? When it comes to immigration, the power of the government is much higher than what the courts say in immigration, what the investment in civil liberties, right? What the person's rights are versus the needs of the government. And so it's one place where the government really has some of the most expansive powers. They can say, the government can make distinctions on race when it comes to immigration or nationality, when it comes to immigration, which they wouldn't be able to do in other circumstances. So it all kind of intersects together. So, do you have a right to enter the United States? And this is one where the powers for the government are really big, and your powers as a foreign national or your rights as a foreign national are very small. So if you are a US citizen, yes, you have a right to enter the United States. Okay. Everybody else does not have a right to enter the United States. Everybody else has to prove that they are admissible to the United States when they enter. So that's true for permanent residents or F1 holders or J1 holders. No matter how many times you've come in and out of the US, every single time you enter, you are having to prove it. And it is up to the officer to let you in or not. Just because you have a visa stamp doesn't guarantee you get to be entered, right? And remember, Department of Homeland Security, ICE, is immigration and customs enforcement. And customs is actually even broader powers than immigration. What do I mean? Well, they can go through your suitcase. They can look on your laptop. They can look at your phone, right? They can do they can seize your assets under their customs powers. And so this is really a place, like I said, where the government has the broadest powers. So at the port of entry, that immigration officer can ask you kind of anything he feels like. If you're a US citizen, you can refuse to answer, right? You can say, no, I'm not going to answer. Usually you're probably required to tell them where you traveled to, but like they can't ask you questions about your religion or things like that, and you could refuse to answer. If you are not a US citizen, right? In that context, refusing to answer the officer's questions could lead the officer to assume that you're hiding something, you're not cooperative, and they could deny you entry. And in that 5 categories, right, the further down you are, the more likely that is, right? So if you're a permanent resident there's a little, you're likely to have a more interaction with the officer, or he'll say, oh, well, I'm just going to send you to a judge. Whereas if you're a non-immigrant, he can just refuse entry and doesn't necessarily have to give you the option to go in front of a judge or anything like that. So if you decline answering questions, you have to be prepared for additional screening and probably a denial of your entry. Okay. And that's about, so admissibility has like all these grounds of things where an officer can say, no, you don't get to come in. And it's really broad. And a lot of them give the officer a lot of power, right? The law says reason to believe. Well, that's like the lowest thing in the terms of standards in the law, right? Beyond a reasonable doubt, if you've ever watched Law and Order, beyond a reasonable doubt is the super highest. Well, I think you're suspicious. Like that's like super low. And that's where what the admissibility law talks about. Like, I think you might have done something bad. I don't have to let you in. So the border is an example where the officers have the broadest power. Okay. What kind of power do they have in other situations? Well, it depends. It depends who's acting, what are they trying to do, who, what, where, when, why. So a police officer who's like pulling you over for a speeding ticket, right, in that traffic stop has a set of powers. A police officer chasing after a guy that he just saw commit a crime, right? Like he has a one set of powers. But a police officer who's like investigating a crime, you know, has a different set of powers versus an immigration officer, right? Is that immigration officer acting to enforce a criminal law? Or is that immigration officer acting to enforce an immigration law? And so, does it sound complicated? It is. Do we know exactly where all of these things land? No, we don't. We have ideas, right? But, things like Miranda rights, the things that they say in every episode of Law and Order, right? You have the right to remain silent. You have the right to an attorney. Those like only came into law, I think, like in the 60s, right? So those are kind of new like in the world of law, that's new, right? Remember, turtles everywhere, turtles all the way down. But really, what power does law enforcement have is all the power we give them. The number one way that police officers get access to the trunk of your car or ICE gets access to your house is you let them in, right? So everybody needs to learn I do not consent. Just like we're going to make t-shirts, we're going to say, I do not consent. That's like what you need to know. Because when you consent away the rights that you have, it's done, right? They can do whatever we let them do.
Hey,
Um,
Kathleen,
yeah,
are you intending to share slides right now? Oh, you
I
are.
am
I just
trying
saw
to
the
clear
wrong screen.
signs.
I see them now. Okay, continue.
Were they not being shared?
No, they were. I was clicking on the wrong thing. So you are
Oh,
good. That was a
okay,
me error.
good. Good, good, good.
Continue.
Okay. Whew. It'd be very sad if there had been no slides up to this point, because I love a good slide. Um, so, all right. So I think I've said this. We are all finding out what powers ICE has. Okay. So ICE can ask anyone any question, right? Like I can ask anyone any question. That doesn't mean they have to answer. Okay. Where we then run into with ICE is, or any police officer, is if I refuse to answer, or if I say, you know, let's just say I say something like, oh, where'd you get those shoes? Which is a New Orleans joke. But let's say I just say something to the officer that's not an answer to their question. Does that give the officer the power to detain me? Right? That's what we worry about. Like it's Anybody can ask a question, but do I have the right to refuse to answer? Or does my refusal get interpreted as a ground to be taken into custody? So ICE has a lot of powers when it comes to immigration. Their rights in criminal investigations are limited, just like the police are limited. But when it talks about immigration, it's different. And it gets all blurred together, right? It's, oh, well, I stopped them based on immigration, and then there was a criminal charge later on. So ICE can, if they have a reasonable suspicion, they can briefly detain, right? Like, what is briefly detain? Oh, I make you stand there on the street for a half hour, or maybe even like, where's the line where it goes into an arrest? We're finding it out. ICE is going to say it's not an arrest until I drive you downtown and fingerprint and book you. I might say, well, it's an arrest when they tell you that you have to get in the back of the car. So, if in that brief detention they come up with a reason to believe, so very low, reason to believe, lower than probable cause, so less than what the police have to have, then they can transition to an arrest. So, can you stop ICE from arresting you? Probably not. They can arrest whoever they want. What we want to do in our interactions with ICE or the police or anybody else is say things that later on give somebody, your lawyer, a weapon to fight, right? So we say we either don't talk or we refuse or we say, I do not consent, or we say, am I free to go? Okay. I'm going to jump to a different slide and then I'm going to come back. So if you're walking down the street and you are approached by an ICE officer, what are you required to do? Well, if you are in status, if you are a foreign national, so not a US citizen, in legal status, you are required to identify yourself and present documents. Okay. If you are not legally in the US, you need to talk to a lawyer about whether or not it is in your interest to remain silent, or is it in your interest to identify yourself and say, I don't have a status. Okay. That's not, I don't have a one size fits all for that scenario. But if you are an F1, J1 permanent, like you remember, you're required to have your documents, you're required to show them. If you are a US citizen, you decide how you want to deal with ICE. And I guarantee there's a lot of different responses out there. But remember, there's no right answer. Be very situationally aware. I think there has been a lot of incidents recently that I think have people very afraid to like stand up to ICE and, say some things to ICE that we would want to say to them. So on the street, if you're a US citizen, right? ICE comes up or the police come up, they say something to you. The magic words are, am I free to go? And if they say yes, you walk away. If they say no, you say, what is the charge? Why am I being detained? And as my friends in CBP say, you can always tell who are the domestics, meaning the US citizens, because they're the biggest headache. So, okay, now, what about if ICE comes to your house, right? And they knock on the door. So most courts, right, are going to say ICE cannot come into your home unless they have a judicial warrant. And so ICE can make their own warrants. That's called an agency warrant or an administrative warrant. But to enter your home, they need more because your rights and the protection, the sanctity of your home has a lot of protections under the Constitution, right? Your home has a lot of protections, whereas walking down the street doesn't have the same protections. Now, ICE has recently said that they think they don't need one to enter a home, and we're all going to fight and find out together. So, if they come to your house and knock on the door, number one, don't open the door. Don't open the door. Don't step out to talk to them. Say, who are you? Are you with immigration? Show me your badge. Show me the warrant. Show it through the window. Slip it under the door. I do not consent to you entering my house. Can you prevent five guys with guns from busting down your door? No. But you're creating weapons for somebody later on. Now, this, those of you who've been looking at the news know that there was an ICE arrest at a dormitory in a university, I think last week. And ICE lied and said they were looking for a missing kid and maybe said they were police and not immigration. And that's all going to get sorted out in court, what they said or what they did. So, number one, a dorm is a residence, but the campus sometimes can give access to the building to law enforcement. What your campus policy is, I don't know. If you are not happy with your campus policy, you need to bring it up on campus and talk about it and see if you can get more rules or protections. A lot of campuses have, oh, if police come, they have to go through campus security, and campus security vets them and does all this other stuff. But if you're at your apartment, right, you want to make sure you're making the officer identify themselves. They are supposed to identify themselves as immigration if you ask, are you with immigration? They have to say yes or no. They're supposed to state a reason for the arrest. If they don't do that, that's a weapon for later on, right? It's not for this battle, it's a weapon for later on. So, what what officers are doing and where the law is going to push them back is two different questions, okay? So that's why we ask, where are you, what agency are you with? What's your badge? Okay. Um, I went through all of this. They have to have a warrant. If you have work authorization and you are at your workplace, um, ICE can come into the areas of your work that are public, right? So if let's say, you already have your green card and you're waiting tables at a restaurant, right? So ICE can come into the dining room because everybody in public comes into the dining room, but they can't go into the office or the kitchen because that's not open to the public unless they have a warrant or they're in hot pursuit, okay? So if you are frightened, don't panic, don't run away, but you can just say, am I free to go? Right? If they say no, what am I being detained for? And in an enforcement situation where ICE is trying to arrest an individual, they will sometimes say nobody can leave because it's a safety issue, right? We can't keep us safe and you safe if people are moving around. But that's kind of all you can really do. Don't, if you are working up front and there's people in the back, don't run to the kitchen door, open the door, and yell run, because that's now obstruction of justice. Okay. And now you are going to get in trouble, not because of your immigration status, but because you're interfering with law enforcement. Okay. So when you have contact with law enforcement, let's say it's a police officer or you decide you don't want to, um, you know, it's not in your interest you don't have a status. So you can always remain silent. And in the criminal context, you absolutely want to. In the immigration context, you can remain silent, but ICE can interpret it as an admission, right? They can use it against you, which is different from the criminal context. So if you want to remain silent, say, I'm going to be silent, and then keep your mouth shut after that. If you say, I want an attorney, say, I want an attorney, and then don't answer any questions until you've had a chance to talk to your attorney. Don't lie, don't give false documents. You can refuse. It's always important to say, like they say, I'm going to look in your bag. I do not consent. You can't get away with that at the airport. You can, like, if you're on the street. When you say, I do not consent, they could still go through your bag. Again, it's weapons for later, not necessarily trying to stop the interaction at that moment. If you get arrested, then the officer can check your belongings, check your body for weapons to make sure you're safe. So an arrest is not just a detention, but taking you into custody with a plan to hold you and either charge you with an immigration violation or a criminal violation. You do have the right to speak to an attorney when you are entering the United States. The guys at the border are going to tell you you don't have a right to an attorney in that context. I disagree with them, but that's what they're going to say. And so you have to kind of be prepared to, like, make sure somebody knows when you're coming in. They call the lawyer when that certain time has passed. But if you get detained, you do have a right to speak to a lawyer. If you are in immigration custody, they have to give you a list of pro bono lawyers, which are hard to come by. You also have the right to contact your consulate, right? So a lot of consulates will help support you with your immigration things. It's a really good idea to be really, really careful about what you're signing. If you are not 100% sure, you probably don't want to sign it, because ICE will try to get you to sign paperwork that says, I just want to go home. Okay. Even if you have really good arguments or really good ways to stay in the United States. Oh, wait, that's a duplicate slide. Okay. If you have any contact with law enforcement anywhere in the world, I mean, anything from I got a ticket walking on campus because I was underage and drinking, to shoplifting, to speeding tickets, to I didn't pay my speeding tickets, to anything at all, you probably need to be keeping copies of all of those documents, because you probably will have to disclose it in the immigration context. So, and through your immigration journey, you get asked these questions all the time. And not disclosing it is always going to be a problem. If it is something, especially if it's something that's meaningful or material. Almost any time that you have contact with law enforcement, if they've taken your fingerprints or, made a copy of your ID or written down your information, it's almost always going into these big databases that Department of Homeland Security can see, right? Certain kinds of arrests, if it's alcohol or drug related, you could get, like, I'm serious, like within 12 hours, you could be getting an email from the Department of State that says, we're revoking your visa because they've gotten this hit through the database. And an alcohol or drug related offense triggers a ground of inadmissibility and is, like I said, can be a problem even if there's not a conviction. So it can all happen real time. If a criminal lawyer tells you that your thing has been erased or expunged, that may be true for employment inside the US. It is not true for immigration. Nothing ever disappears for immigration. And so you have to be disclosing it, or you need to be very clear. Talk to an immigration attorney before you don't disclose something. Fraud is worse, right? Having a fraud charge is worse. So almost all sorts of criminal issues are going to have an impact on immigration status. Drug and alcohol are big ones. Claiming to be a citizen of the US is always a problem. And for those of you who got fake IDs to go drink, guess what that is? That's a false claim to US citizenship if it's like a US driver's license. And so that kind of thing can have really big, big consequences for you. Anything relating to domestic violence or domestic altercations, even if there's not a criminal charge, but there's something like a temporary restraining order, you need to talk to an attorney about it because there might be repercussions, and it's really important to be thinking about it. Okay. So if you get arrested, let's say you get arrested by the police, you need both a good criminal attorney and a good immigration attorney. Okay. And very rarely is that the same person. The You need to memorize a phone number of someone who will answer their phone. Ideally, this is also a person who will has access to money to bail you out of jail. Because when you get arrested, they take your phone. You can't look up a phone number in the phone, right? So you need to make sure you have a phone number memorized. You need to keep every scrap of paper, take pictures, scan it, save it to the cloud, and make sure you really can show from start to finish everything that happened in that interaction or afterwards with the court or things like that. So in the criminal process, we all have the same rights to be quiet, to have an attorney, but depending on where you are, the court may not advise you about the immigration consequences or may not realize you also have immigration issues. The immigration and criminal are separate. And so you need to be self-advocating for those issues. We already talked about everything on here. We talked about everything in there. Oh, I must have like duplicated my slide set. If you are taken into criminal custody, it is very likely that ICE is going to put a detainer on you if you are not a US citizen. Maybe if you are a US citizen, but they don't think you really are. I mean, that happens once in a while too. So if ICE puts a detainer on you, it means that when your time with the criminal custody is finished, they have a set time to come pick you up and take you into immigration custody. So it is an issue about do we want to pay the criminal bond and get you into immigration custody or not sometimes. They don't always pick everybody up, but the law is getting broader and broader about who they are mandated to pick up. Okay. So an ICE detainer can also limit the types of probation you're eligible for and different types of things. So that's part of why you need a good criminal attorney and a good immigration attorney. Most of the time, it is not fast to get deported. Let's say I'm in F1 and I switched the price tags on a very expensive purse, and I got busted for shoplifting. And it's going to be expensive because it was like a really expensive purse, right? In the thousands of dollars. So let's say I get taken into custody by the police, I get convicted by the police, and now the question is am I going to be deported? Okay, is ICE going to do something with me? Well, ICE is going to have to, I came in with permission, ICE is going to have to say, do you want to, we want to deport you. Do you want to just sign this piece of paper and go home? Or do you want to fight in front of an immigration judge? I'm going to say, oh, I want to fight in front of an immigration judge because I have a US citizen boyfriend and we're going to get married and we're going to take care of this. Okay. So then we look at, is ICE going to let you out of custody? Have you triggered something that will let ICE let you out of custody? They have to issue what's called a notice to appear to start the process of deportation. You have a right to go in front of an immigration judge. You can waive it or you can fight out your removal proceedings. Now, not all non-US citizens have the right to removal proceedings, right? If I am arriving to the US and knocking at the door, I don't necessarily have rights to the full removal proceedings. If I've been in deportation before, I may not have the right to new proceedings. If I came in on ESTA, I might not have rights to deportation proceedings. So if you have a right for deportation proceedings, it can be a long process, and it has all these formalities, but it doesn't always exist. So, how do you avoid problems? The number one way you avoid problems is you take the most conservative interpretation of immigration law and maintain your status. You don't do anything that looks like it might be a violation of status, right? You go to school full time. You do not work without authorization. You don't drink underage. You don't get in a car with somebody who's been drinking and has drugs in the back seat, right? Because you're going to be the one who gets in the most trouble. So maintain your status, maintain your documents, start early on figuring out your next steps of immigration. Stay, if you were F1J1, stay in touch with your international office, right? Your DSO RO, meaning the person who signs your forms, is like the best resource for you. And so that's the number one way we deal with extreme enforcement is extreme compliance, right? We make sure everything is absolutely in order. So what do I mean about maintenance of status? So F1 is a great example. So the purpose of F1 is to pursue a degree, not to work, not to do other things, right? So pursue your degree, stay in school, go to classes, do all of those things that you were required to do to get your status. And that's true for J or H or whatever. Work, do what you're supposed to do within the rules. Anything that looks like a violation could have a problem, right? Could have an impact. Does it look like you worked without authorization? Did it look like you were doing something wrong? That can be a problem. And so it can impact all of your different levels of immigration, right? Your ability to change status. It can impact your ability to get a new visa. It can impact your ability to show that your brain, your intent, matches the type of status that you have. Be really, really careful about what you have out there on social media. Okay. So we want to make sure that you're absolutely consistent, right? You don't get to inflate your LinkedIn profile. Sorry, right? You want to make sure that everything's out there because it's going to lead to other issues. Okay. We're almost at time, but I have a few things. Okay. Always check your I-94. Every time you enter the United States, make sure you log into CBP and you download that I-94. That's what says what your status is, where you get to go, what you get to do, how long you get to stay. The earlier you catch problems in your I-94, the more options we have to fix it. If it's a year later, there may not be a way to fix it. So you need to be really careful about your I-94. Be really careful about receiving what's called public benefits in the United States. This is a place where we know that immigration is getting really interested in and active in. And it's always been something they've looked at. It's not new, right? It's always come up at the embassy. It's about your ability to financially maintain your status in the US and things like that. But where are we mostly concerned, right? So we're concerned about things like take using like the household using services that a non-immigrant or a non-citizen is not eligible for, right? Like, was there like housing subsidies or was there like food stamps or was there different types of support? One thing that has in the past not been an issue, right, is I come as an F, my spouse is with me, my spouse gets pregnant and has a baby and we get support for pregnant women and we get we get emergency Medicare paid for the birth. Is this something that can be a problem? Yeah, I think it might. I think that's one of that could be a future issue. So, not everything that is um, a government support, though, counts as a public benefit. So, we always want to be really careful. We talked about this being very careful about work. So, that is all right on time, 4:57. So I can do Q&A now. I love it.
Beautiful. Okay, I'll go through some pre-submitted questions. If anybody wants to throw any additional questions in the chat, or if you have follow-up to any of the responses. But actually, Kathleen, you covered a lot, but maybe we want to highlight a few um, like important areas. So, for example, there were a lot of questions that came in around uh, um, engaging with ICE, or if ICE officers approach you, and so you covered this, but maybe just a quick review on what are rights if they're approached by ICE on or off campus. Is there a distinction? And then is how is that different based upon their immigration status?
Right. So, okay. Let's, so the first thing I have to say is a lot of times we assume the officer talking to us is ICE, and maybe they're not. So after nine, and I'm going somewhere with this story, I promise, which is so after 9/11, we saw a lot of different government law enforcement officers coming onto campus to engage in different types of interactions. We had ICE officers talking to DSOs. We had FBI agents talking to departments. We had all sorts of stuff happening. Okay. And so the questions are like, if ICE is on your campus, one is like, how are we going to know they're ICE? Right now, there's a lot of enforcement activity that's happening, and the person doing the enforcement is not in a uniform, right? So first thing we always want to do is ask the officer to identify themselves. Ideally, they're going to say something, they're not just going to come up and talk to you, but we've also had weird situations. Like there was a college frat prank at a college near here where like students on campus were pretending to be ICE against other students on campus. So ask, who are you? What are you with? Who are you with? Can I see your badge? If you say, yes, I'm ICE, I'm with, this is who I'm with. Well, then, so as a foreign national, let's go with the hypothetical, I am an F1 student. Okay. If I'm walking down the street and somebody comes up to me and says, hey, who are you? Keep walking. Or the ICE officer comes up and says, hey, I know that somebody comes up and says, hey, are you an international student? I would just keep walking because how do I know that they're not crazy? But then let's assume they say, hey, I'm an ICE officer or I'm the police. You need to stop and talk to me. You say, okay, officer. Then I would say, my name's Kathleen Gasparian. I'm in F1 status. And they say, let me see your papers. Okay. Right? Because I'm required to have my papers on me. I'm required to identify. And then in theory, right, I should just be allowed to go. If, and then after that, you could ask, am I free to go? And if they say no, you say, is there a charge? Or can you let me know what this is about? And maybe they just say no. And in that moment, all we want to do is keep ourselves safe, right? If we can say the magic words, am I free to go? Or if we can remember to say the magic words, what agency are you with? Why am I being stopped? Great, because those give us tools for later on. But your number one in that interaction with a big guy with big guns and everything else is to get out alive, right? Like that's all we want to do. So if you can remember those things, that's great. Now, on campus, if it's like in the public areas of campus, unless your campus is gated and has rules about who can come on campus, it's pretty much the same as like walking down the street. If they're coming into the buildings, right, it's going to depend on the type of building. Is it a building with public and private areas, like a lab, right? Like if it's a lab and nobody's authorized, they have to have consent or a warrant to enter the lab. If it's a dorm, same thing. They're supposed to have consent or a warrant to enter the lab. It's like I said, there was one a couple weeks ago that was really problematic because it sounds like they did not tell the truth to gain access to the building. Um, and that's problematic. And that's going to be fought out in a battle in front of a judge and everything else.
Okay, thank you. All right, so another question would be for students from countries with a travel ban or a partial ban. So, for example, one student from Nigeria says, um, what do I do when my F1 visa expires since I cannot travel out of the US to renew it as my country, Nigeria, is on a travel ban?
Right. So remember, the visa sticker in your passport is just your permission to enter the US. It does not govern how long you get to stay in the US. So if your visa sticker in your passport has expired, that's okay. What matters is, do you have a valid I-20 or DS 2019, whatever your status is? Do you have a valid I-94? Um, it means you don't get to go home for the summer, right? Like or you have a choice to make about what your priorities are. But the visa sticker and your status are two separate things.
All right, so if you are from a banned country, no travel. From a partial ban, probably no travel. What do you recommend to other students whose countries are not on any list?
So I think for travel, I'm asking a whole bunch of questions these days. I might have a slide about it. Okay. I am saying I think you need to be really thoughtful about what your priorities are. How close are you to graduation? What are you planning on doing next? Have you had any status violations? Have you had any problems in the past? Have you had any contact with law enforcement? What is your field of research? What is your country of origin? Are you a country that we think is spying on the United States? Um, like all sorts of things, I think are really going to play into what is the risk of travel. So again, if you are not a US citizen, there is no guarantee you get back in. A lot of the times, the risk to you to choose to travel is very, very small, right? Single digits, less than a single digit. But there's lots of things that can raise your risk. And then it's up to you about whether or not that risk and the consequence is worth it. So, like, if you're 2 weeks from graduation, maybe you don't want to take any risks at all because then you're gonna, if you don't get back in, the consequences are so big. Um, but be thinking about it and, start the conversation with your international office. And then if you're still not sure, you know, lots of good immigration attorneys out there. And through Homebase, you guys, Travis, what is it, ZF Visa? Like they're a great resource if you also need to make plans to get a visa. The wait times right now, though, for student visas are getting really long in a lot of parts of the world. So I'd be really thoughtful about travel right now.
Okay, so in the chat, I'm putting the link to uh, the ZF Visa Guide. So these are former consular officers who are now immigration attorneys who really focus, as well as anybody I'm aware of, on what to do around obtaining a visa. So that would be, uh, yeah, all sorts of different visas and all sorts of different times in your journey. Okay, so there's that. Next question. Let me get to the questions. Um, what about a single entry visa? Can someone with a single entry visa go to Canada and or Mexico?
Hmm. So, um, there is a provision. This is really too tricky for this webinar. I would say you need to talk to your international advisor if you're on F or J, or talk to an immigration lawyer. So we do have a provision called auto revalidation, but there can still be risks with travel. So the answer is, I'm not telling you. I don't have enough facts for that law exam question. Thank you.
All right. Um, okay, there were
Because if
lots of
you're
questions.
like, yeah, there's so many. Yes, talk to a lawyer. That's my answer.
By the way, I'll send out Kathleen's contact information in a follow-up email. We'll also send the slides and we'll send the recording. So that'll all come out afterwards. I will say there were a lot of questions around employment authorization, around OPT. First, I would say go to your institution to get information about OPT policies. That is the first place to start. Hopefully, they have great resources to provide to you there that are clear. And the other thing I would say is we will probably have a work authorization session another time. It is a big topic, and we will cover it later. Okay, so a couple questions about public benefits. So one question was from a visually impaired individual, and she is wondering, can she participate um, in benefits to visually impaired, such as discounts on public transportation, et cetera? Anything that she should be aware of specifically to uh, disabled citizens, their rights, and her access to
So
that?
that is a really wonderful question. And I don't know if I have a detailed enough answer off the top of my head. So there are lots of resources that a foreign national can access without triggering the public benefits definition. Okay. And also those grounds of inadmissibility, because it's really about, are you going to be a public charge? Are you going to be a burden on the United States? Can also be overcome through showing education, work history, financial resources. So I think things like, I get a discounted bus pass, that's not real, that's not going to qualify for a public benefit in this context, because like students can get discounted bus passes, or senior citizens or whatever. Those aren't going to be a public benefit. Where is the line? It's like it's going to really depend on the source of the funding. Like my general rule is this, which is if you and a lot of these supports are not based on immigration status at all. There's no correlation to immigration status. In general, except like I think most of the things are probably going to be okay. This is a great question to approach your international office with. Um, and also there are, or like a local resource, because yeah, so I don't have the exact answer as to what's going to be okay and what's not going to be okay. It's really going to depend on who is giving the benefit, what is the benefit, um, and how does that it all connect together. On the whole, I would say most of it's probably okay, but if you are worried about it, it's worth the time to double check. And I'm gonna have to go look that up afterwards.
Okay, thank you, Kathleen. Yeah, there are lots of examples out there. Like for example, I'm aware of one company that helps international students get free health care in New York
Yeah.
um, through public as a public benefit. And so I'd be very curious as to is that putting them at risk? So, okay. Most of the other questions, or all the other questions I could see, were mostly around work authorization, and so we will cover that another time. And so, thank you for coming. And yeah, I think we'll end it there. Thank you so much, Kathleen, for your wise counsel. Is there anything else that you'd like to share as we close up?
No, that sounds great. Thank you guys so much for coming.
Okay, thank you, everyone.